If you've ever been to a climbing gym, an REI, or the team building retreat for a tech startup, you've probably seen this logo. In the past couple of decades, Patagonia has arguably become like the brand in the outdoor space, or at least in the top 3. It's the brand of choice for people climbing El Cap, committing financial crimes, or playing catch with their baby. But the guy who started Patagonia didn't even set out to sell clothes. So let's set the scene. The year is 1959, the first Barbie doll has just hit the market, and this guy, Yvon chouinard, am I pronouncing that right? Is fed up with the way climbing works. He'd spent his entire life from the time that he was like 16, living on literally pennies a day, scrounging food from dumpsters, and basically just living his life with the sole goal of going rock climbing as much as possible. But to understand what he didn't like about rock climbing, we first have to talk a little bit about how climbing works. And I think there's actually a better place for me to explain it. For the uninitiated, climbers these days mostly use a piece of gear that's called a cam. It looks like this. You pull back on it, stick it in the rock, and then it tries to spring back to its larger, wider size. And the harder you pull, the harder it tries to expand. And they get wedged in those cracks pretty good, to the point where a good cam placement is almost as good as being bolted to the rock. But that's not unique. You could feel just as secure on older, cheaper gear. The actual main benefit of cams is that rather than spending forever trying to dig them out when you're done, you just pull them out like this. It takes like 2 seconds. But back in the olden days, none of this stuff had been invented yet. If you wanted to climb a wall and your name wasn't Alex Handhold, you had to use these things called pitons. And pitons were essentially just pointy wedges of steel that you would hammer into the rock until they felt secure, and then clip your carabiner into it. And the pitons that existed when Yvon was coming up were made of a really soft steel. So as you hammered them into the rock, they would get really torn up and misshapen. That meant when you pulled them out, they weren't reusable. So as you would climb up a wall, you would hammer your pitons in and then just sort of leave them there forever. And Yvon was fed up with that, so he made the obvious choice. Probably what any of us would have done, really. He subscribed to Ty Goes Outside. Wait, hold on, that's not right. I don't know how that got in there. He bought an anvil and a forge from a junkyard and was like, yeah, I can make better ones. And then he did. Our outdoorsy autistic king. He melted down steel from old farm equipment and set up shop in his parents' backyard and started making pitons that were harder, more durable, and importantly, reusable. And at first they were just for him, but the thing about being a professional dirtbag is that it's not very profitable. I basically just imagine him like sitting out in the backyard at his forge, just like,
I gotta figure out how to make money on this thing. It's simply too good.
And what he ended up doing was just taking his whole operation on the road. He literally just packed up his forge and anvil into his car and started making pitons wherever he went. And for the moment, wherever was the beach. Surfing was still a relatively niche thing for people to be doing, but Yvon needed a way to fill his winters. So when he wasn't dirtbagging it in Yosemite or Wyoming, he was beach bumming it in Southern California. And whenever he wasn't in the water surfing, he had his hammer and anvil just fucking blacksmithing on the beach. Kind of crazy the shit you could get away with in the 60s. Could you imagine trying to do that on the beach in Southern California today? Anyway, for the next few years, his life was kind of divided into 2 parts. In the winters, he was surfing and pounding out pitons to sell once the weather got warm enough. Which, by the way, he also like made his own surfboard and was really fucking good at surfing. And that's just kind of like the theme of his life. He was just really good at whatever he tried, like fly fishing or climbing or blacksmithing or making clothes, surfing. Yeah, pretty much everything. And once the weather got warm enough, he would take all the gear he had made over the winter and go back on the road. And then he'd set up at all of the well-known climbing areas around the West and just sell it out of his car, like the grocery store parking lot tamale lady, but for dudes in their 20s who haven't showered in a week. And this turned out to be pretty lucrative, enough so that he started a whole company about it called Chouinard Equipment. You can tell he put a lot of thought into that name. And actually, believe it or not, that company didn't even become Patagonia. It became a whole other thing called Black Diamond. We don't even have time to talk about that today. So Yvon was now a certified business owner. Sales were really strong and he was hiring extra people to help meet the demand. But they ran into a problem almost immediately, just not with the products. The pitons that Yvon was selling were still the best on the market, and anybody who was anybody in the climbing world was using them. But he started to notice that the rock walls where people were using this gear were starting to get slowly chipped away. Hundreds of climbers every year were coming and climbing these routes, hammering their own pitons into the wall and then hammering them out when they were done. And over time, this left scars on the rock that would just build up with each new ascent. And as a certified granola boy, an environmentalist even, he wasn't down with that. So he decided to scrap his company's most popular product and start from scratch. And then on a climbing trip to the UK, he found climbers making protection out of the old nuts that fell off of railroad tracks. Literally just like these 6-sided guys, just way bigger. And he took inspiration from that and he invented a type of climbing gear that's actually still used today. It's called a hex. And he also continued the proud American tradition of stealing shit from England, because fuck those guys. And at this point, Chouinard Equipment was thriving with Yvon as the CEO. All the way from literally homeless and living in his car to now buying a company headquarters in Ventura, California. He was still a dirtbag though. The company was basically just made up of him and his climbing homies, and it was basically the opposite of anything you could call well organized. They'd come in late and take like hours-long breaks to go surf as soon as the waves got good. They literally had a disclaimer in their catalogs that said, yeah, if you order stuff in the summer, we're probably not going to deliver it very fast. We're all busy climbing. And somehow, in spite of all that, they became a household name. They were making hexes, carabiners, ice axes, tons of other climbing equipment that the best of the best were using to put up insane routes all around the world. At some point during all this, Yvon was back in the UK doing what he did best, stealing good ideas from the British. We met climbers wearing rugby shirts, and he thought they were badass. They were made of sort of thick cotton, which was nice for colder days at the crag, and also protected you from the sun. And they also had a collar that would protect your neck if you were like hanging gear around it. Ugh. Pretend this is like a rope or something. So he bought some, brought it back to the States, and just started wearing them when he was climbing. And predictably, all of his climbing homies were like, yo, Yvon, these shirts are sick. Where can we buy them? And now finally, 5-6 minutes into the video, I don't actually know how long. I am recording this before I edit it, so. But we're finally getting to the goddamn clothes. But not even Patagonia yet. All this is still Chouinard Equipment. Sue me. This guy's like 100 years old. There's a lot of ground to cover. Anyway, Yvon started just importing existing rugby shirts from England and selling them under the Chouinard Equipment brand. And they were super successful. Not only were they comfortable and functional, but the bright colors were way cooler looking than any of the like drab earth tones that other climbing clothes brands were making at the time. He was selling them faster than he could get them. And it turns out that people buy more clothes than they do carabiners. So pretty soon he was importing rain jackets, shoes, mittens, hats, other stuff to just all sell under his own brand. But for a guy who was obsessive enough to forge his own climbing equipment, letting other people make his clothes wasn't going to be an option long term. He started out with a pair of shorts that he designed and sewed himself. They were called the stand-up shorts, and then just expanded the in-house offerings from there. But having all the climbing gear and the hard goods in the same catalog as the clothes was messy and confusing. So he decided that it was finally time to start a brand just for the clothes. And what do you think he named it? Chouinard Clothes. Nah, I'm just kidding. He named it Patagonia. At this point, the company was popular within the niche community that Yvon and his friends were part of, but it was still relatively small. But they were about to make a decision that would change that. While looking for a way to make a lighter, warmer jacket, an employee of Patagonia stumbled across a thick pile of fleece, a kind of thing that wasn't even made for clothes. It was the type of thing you would normally see on like old bath mats or on the toilet seat at your grandma's house. And while making jackets out of synthetic fleece wasn't like common, it wasn't brand new. What was new is that rather than putting the flat side of the fleece outward, they put the thick pile part facing outward. And the jackets that they made out of that looked fucking crazy. Some might even say ugly, but they were super popular. And they introduced a new era for Patagonia, making clothes out of synthetics instead of organic materials like wool and cotton. So making clothes out of plastic, which is probably like fine and wouldn't cause any problems down the line, right? Right? From here, the growth was almost exponential. Patagonia was doubling or tripling or quadrupling their income every single year. They started a super popular marketing campaign where customers of Patagonia could send in pictures of them doing crazy shit in their gear, and they would use those images in their catalogs. That's where that picture of the flying baby comes from. And things continued on like that. They became the go-to brand for everyone from casual hikers to hardcore alpinists. And they had their own growing pains like small companies do, but they were determined and they figured it out. And honestly, I don't have time to go over the entire history of the company, but just to summarize, the next 20 years were filled with innovation, humanitarian projects, Patagonia wading their way into public policy, and just generally grappling with the fact that a company that had been started by people who wanted to protect the environment was now seemingly at odds with that goal. And all of this brings us to 2017. On March 20th, 2017, Forbes officially added Yvon Chouinard to their list of billionaires. At this point, Patagonia had yearly sales numbers in the hundreds of millions, and the company itself was worth something like $3 billion. This was the ultimate achievement. Becoming a billionaire is something that only like the tiniest fraction of people, delusional people, even aspire to. And the number that actually achieve it is so small that it basically rounds down to zero. For most people, this would be the fulfillment of their life's mission. For Yvon, in his own words, it was the worst day of his life. For basically his entire life, he'd been sitting on the fence between two worlds. On one hand, he was a climber. He was a dirtbag. All he wanted to do was go out and touch rocks and protect the environment and probably just disappear into the woods. On the other hand, he was the founder and the head of one of the largest outdoor companies in the world. Even with the best intentions, his company was responsible for thousands of tons of waste every year, putting microplastics and PFAS into the water supply and just generally like causing the kind of environmental harm that he wanted to fix. He'd spearheaded dozens of environmental conservation projects, both personally and through Patagonia, but to him, it didn't feel like enough. The existence of billionaires, in his mind, was a failure of public policy. But if the government couldn't find a way to spend his money to help the environment, then he'd have to do it himself. So he made a plan to give it all away. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before, and it took his lawyers literal years to figure out a solution that would guarantee the company could continue to operate under its do good first philosophy and could never get acquired or taken over by somebody who would try to change that. What they ended up doing was putting all of Patagonia's voting shares, which had previously been held by Yvon and his wife and his kids, into a trust, and that trust would be overseen by the family and a few other trusted people. Normally, whoever owned those voting shares would basically single-handedly be able to decide the direction of the company, but because they were locked in a trust, no one person could come in and try to take over and change what the company was doing. The rest of the non-voting shares were transferred to a nonprofit that would be the actual beneficiary that would receive all of Patagonia's profits and then decide how to allocate those funds to other organizations or whatever to help the environment. And I know that this entire video has been relatively favorable of Patagonia. I don't want to let them off the hook entirely. They've definitely had their controversies. They still make most of their clothes out of plastic. They've definitely been accused of greenwashing in their marketing. But they've also dragged basically the entire outdoor clothing industry behind them, kicking and screaming, into more sustainable business practices. As such a large company, they can pressure the factories they use to pay and treat workers better. They can pressure manufacturers to use more recycled materials in their fabrics. And as they make those things the standard, it means that other companies that use those factories, intentionally or otherwise, are operating more sustainably and ethically as well. And honestly, it's just really fucking inspiring to see somebody create something so cool from such small beginnings and also not lose themselves in the process. I really enjoyed learning about Patagonia and Yvon for this video, and if you did too, and if you want to see more content like this, or gear reviews, or adventures, or honestly just kind of whatever I'm finding interesting at the time, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.